Thanks for visiting my reading room. I'm Nancy, and it's my pleasure to be here reading to all you young people. I need practice myself, so if you find me dozing off at a given point and messing up a word or connecting two words that make absolutely no sense, it has been known to happen, and I just want you to know. This is my soapbox. This is the area where I can work on it. So please bear with me. My reading is a bit imperfect, but I'm a big fan of reading aloud because I know that it enriches our lives. And I think with today's bombardment of technology, we tend to forget reading altogether, or you don't make time for it, or there just doesn't seem to be enough time. But anyway, I'm happy to do this. So if you enjoy my channel, please like, share, and subscribe. And I thank you here now for any and all donations. I know that I don't have many subscribers because my channel is new, and I'm waiting till I get enough material on there before I actually open it up to the public. I mean, it is open up, but it's not really well known or anything. Some people might even consider it a bit boring. So, but I don't. I love doing this, and I'm going to keep going. So hang in there with me, and I hope you gain something from the story. Today's classic read is a great illustrated classic of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and so I hope you enjoy it. And we begin. And this is an adaptation, once again. A lot of these novels are adaptations made for younger readers. This one is edited by Malvina Vogel. And let's see who this is adapted by. Marion, Leighton. So I want to get credit where credit is due. Chapter 1, The Mysterious Message, page 7. It was the year 1775, and both France and England were on the brink of revolution. King George III of England was too busy handling his country's problems with the American colonies to worry about his own people's poverty. King Louis XVI of France and the noblemen of his court were more concerned with their own pleasures and wealth to worry about the poor, hungry, lower classes who had begun to make plans to overthrow their rulers. So it was that London and Paris, the capitals of the two countries, were uneasy as the revolution drew near. There was much crime in England during this period. Thus, it was not surprising that the passengers in the mail coach traveling out of London one Friday night, late in November, feared for their safety when the sound of a galloping horse came from behind the coach. The guard cocked his pistol. "Stop, or I shall fire," he shouted. The rider slowed down and stopped. "I must speak to one of the passengers heading for Dover," he called out. "Mr. Jarvis Laurie." The guard turned to the passengers. "Which one of you is Mr. Laurie?" he asked. Here I am," replied a trembling gentleman of about 60. "Who wants me?" "It's Jerry Cruncher," answered the rider. "I have a message from Tellson's." "Very well," Mr. Laurie told the guard. "I know this messenger. I work for Tellson's Bank in London, and so does he." Mr. Laurie took the paper the rider handed him into the coach. He unfolded it and read to himself, "Wait at Dover for Mamselle." Then he turned to the rider. "Jerry, can you say that my answer is recalled to life?" "That's a mighty strange answer," muttered the messenger as he climbed back onto his horse. Mr. Laurie, meanwhile, began to doze, as did the other passengers, but his sleep was not a restful one, for his dreams were filled with scenes of him digging a man out of a grave. Over and over, Jarvis Laurie asked the ghost, "How long have you been buried?" "Almost 18 years, was the ghost's repeated reply. "Do you know that you are being recalled to life?" "They tell me so." When these conversations became loud enough to waken the other passengers, they nudged Mr. Laurie awake. It was during one of these waking moments, in the black of night, that Mr. Laurie saw the other two passengers leave the coach and walked off down the road. By mid-morning, the mail coach arrived in Dover, the departure point for boats crossing the English Channel to Calais, France. Mr. Laurie arranged for a room at the Royal Gorge Inn in Dover, since the boat would not be leaving until the following afternoon. Then he told the innkeeper, "Please prepare another room for a young lady who will arrive today. She will ask for Mr. Laurie of Tellson's Bank." "You gentlemen from Tellson's do quite a bit of traveling, don't you?" commented the innkeeper. "Yes, we have offices in both London, England, and France," explained Mr. Laurie, "but I have not done any traveling in 15 years. It was that evening, as Jarvis Laurie was finishing his dinner, that a waiter informed him that a Miss Bennett had arrived. Leaving his dessert unfinished, Mr. Laurie hurried upstairs. Entering Lucy Bennett's sitting room, he saw a young lady of no more than 17. She was short, slim, pretty, with golden long hair and deep-set blue eyes that met Mr. Laurie's with a questioning look. That look made him recall a child whom he had held in his arms during a passage across the English Channel from France to England 15 years before. He knew that she had been that child, but Lucy Bennett, of course, did not recognize him. "I'm pleased to meet you, Miss Bennett," said Mr. Laurie, making a formal bow. The young lady motioned Mr. Laurie to a chair and got right down to business. "I received a letter yesterday from Tellson's Bank, sir, informing me about a discovery regarding some property of my poor father, who has been dead for so long. The property, I believe, is in France." Her voice trailed off, and she wiped away a tear, then struggled to continue. "The letter said I was to go to Paris to meet with a gentleman the bank was sending there. That gentleman is myself. Since the gentleman had already left London, a messenger was sent after him to ask him to please wait for me here in Dover. The bank also told me that the gentleman would give me all the details of the property, some of which would be rather surprising. Naturally, I am eager to know what they are." "Naturally," agreed Mr. Laurie as he adjusted his wig nervously. Finally, he looked directly at the young lady and began his story. "I will tell you first about one of our bank's customers, a French gentleman of great talents, a scientist, a doctor whom I'd had the pleasure of serving at Tellson's Bank in Paris at the time of his marriage to an English lady about 20 years ago. Then, sir, what are you telling me is my own father's story?" She stopped, her forehead wrinkling in bewilderment. Then a faint smile crossed her face as she went on. "It is a story you know because it was you who brought me to England when my mother died, just 2 years after my father's death." Mr. Laurie took Lucy's hand and brought it gently to his lips. "Yes, child, it was I," he said. "I had a close business relationship with your father, and although I usually keep all personal feelings out of my business—" Mr. Laurie nervously adjusted his wig again, sighed, then returned to his story. "Yes, this is your father's story. Now, here is the difference. If he had not died when he did, but had rather disappeared, silently and suddenly, sent away to a terrible place by a powerful enemy, who could sign some papers imprisoning him for as long as the enemy wished—" Lucy gasped and grabbed Mr. Laurie's arm. "If the gentleman's wife had begged the king for news of him and never received a reply, and furthermore, if the wife had suffered so much from his disappearance before the birth of her daughter—" Yes, what then?" begged Lucy. "If the mother's suffering was so great that she decided to raise the child to believe that the father was dead." Lucy Bennett jumped up from her chair and threw herself onto the floor at Mr. Laurie's feet. "I beg you, sir, tell me everything," she cried, gripping his wrists. "Please control yourself, Miss Bennett." And gently lifting her from the floor, Mr. Laurie went on. "Although your mother never stopped searching for your father, she died broken-hearted when you were only 2 years old. Your parents had no great wealth, and we have found no new money or property, but—" "But what?" gasped Lucy, tightening her grip on his wrists. Mr. Laurie took a deep breath. "Your father has been found. Alexandra Bennett is alive, but he has changed so much that no one would recognize him. He has been freed from that French prison and taken to the house of a faithful servant in Paris. We are going there tomorrow. I, to identify him if I can, you, to comfort him and restore him back to health. The young woman trembled violently. I will see his ghost, not him, she whispered as if in a trance. His ghost has never haunted me. To see him now, never having seen him before, and knowing he is my father, a broken man. There is one more thing you should know, interrupted Mr. Laurie. He was found under another name. Do not ask any questions about that, for it could only be dangerous in France. The people who put your father in prison still rule the country, and even I, an Englishman and a representative of an important bank, do not dare speak of it or carry papers referring to it. I simply use the code words recalled to life, to refer to Alexandra Manette's release from prison. Lucy Manette did not answer. Sitting perfectly still and silent, her eyes frozen wide open, she had fainted. Afraid to move, for Lucy's hand was still gripping his, Jarvis Laurie shouted for help. A wild-looking woman with red hair rushed in from an adjoining room. Grabbing Mr. Laurie's jacket with a brawny hand, she lifted him from his chair and sent him flying across the room. Just then, the inn's servants appeared, also in response to the call for help, and the woman sent them scurrying for cold water and smelling salts. After carrying Lucy to a sofa and stroking her head tenderly, the woman turned to Jarvis Laurie. Why couldn't you tell her what you had to without frightening her to death? She shouted. This, then, was Miss Pross, who had taken care of Lucy since childhood and was traveling with her from London to Paris. Jarvis Laurie could not help feeling ashamed, and after seeing Lucy regain consciousness, he hurriedly left the room. Chapter 2. Recalled to Life. Saint Antoine was a poor section of Paris with houses so run down that the people spent most of their time on the street. Saint Antoine was also filled with hunger, and because of it, the ragged people were filled with hatred toward the wealthy and noble classes of Paris, who cared nothing for their misery. And so it was that Saint Antoine was rapidly becoming a center of unrest which would soon explode in the French Revolution. It was in a narrow Saint Antoine street one day that a large cask of wine dropped from a cart and shattered on the rough stones outside a wine shop. All the people on the street stopped what they were doing to run over and drink the wine. Some knelt down, scooping their hands together, and sipped every drop they could find. Others licked the wine from the stones. Mothers dipped rags into the wine and squeezed drops into infants' mouths. Children built little mud walls to trap puddles of wine and drank mixtures of wine and mud. The wine stains left the street looking blood-stained, and indeed it wouldn't be long before blood would flow in these very streets. The owner of the wine shop, a fierce-looking dark-haired man of about 30, stood watching the mad scramblings on the street. "It is not my problem," muttered Ernest Defarge with a shrug. "Let the people from the market bring another cask. It's their fault." And with that, he turned and went into his shop. Therese Defarge, his wife, looked up from her seat behind the counter in the wine shop when her husband entered. Although her hands were busy knitting, a lift of her eyebrows and a slight nod of her head indicated to her husband that he should notice the elderly gentleman and the young lady seated at the corner table sipping some wine. Jarvis Laurie and Lucy Manette had also noticed Ernest Defarge when he entered the shop, and with a nod of his head, Mr. Laurie told Lucy, "This is our man." Monsieur Defarge pretended not to notice the elderly gentleman and the young lady as he went behind the counter to serve a customer. Madame Defarge coughed and raised her eyebrows even higher, never losing a stitch in her knitting. As soon as the customer had left the shop, Mr. Laurie went up to the counter and spoke softly with Monsieur Defarge. After they had exchanged a few whispered words, Defarge nodded and headed for the door. Mr. Laurie beckoned to Lucy to follow them out of the shop. Although Madame Defarge continued to knit, her eyes followed her husband and his two visitors out the door. Defarge led Mr. Laurie and Lucy toward a narrow, winding, tiled staircase off a garbage-filled, dark courtyard, which was surrounded by high, rotting buildings. "Is he alone?" whispered Mr. Laurie. "Of course. He is always alone," snapped Defarge, "and he is in the same exact state he was when his friends asked if I would risk taking him in and not breathe a word about the matter to anyone." They climbed the stairs, and when they searched the closed door at the top, Defarge inserted a key in the lock. Mr. Laurie turned to Lucy. "Come, child, we are going to see your father," he said, putting his arm around her waist to support her. "I'm afraid to see him," she cried, her knees weakening. "I'm afraid to see my father." Chapter 3. The Shoemaker. The attic was small and dark. A white-haired man was sitting on a low bench, his back to the door, facing the room's only window. He was stooped over a pair of shoes that he was making. "Good day," said Monsieur Defarge, walking towards the window. "I see you are still working hard." The white head was raised for a moment, but did not turn toward the doorway. "Yes, I am working," said a weak, pitiful voice. An unfinished shoe was in the old man's hand, and some simple tools and scraps of leather on the bench before him. "You have a visitor," said Defarge, pointing to Mr. Laurie, who now joined him at the window, leaving Lucy by the door, still out of the shoemaker's sight. The shoemaker turned and stared blankly at Mr. Laurie. The old man's bright eyes stood out of his hollow face, and his ragged white hair and beard contrasted sharply with his dark eyebrows. His shirt, yellowed with age, was in rags. The hand that he raised to shield his eyes from the light coming through the door was as withered and worn as the rest of his body. "Tell the gentleman what kind of shoe you are working on," prodded Defarge. After a long pause, the old man replied, "It is a lady's shoe, a young lady's walking shoe." "And what is the shoemaker's name?" "My name? 105 North Tower." And that was all the old shoemaker said. Then he bent over his work once more. "Dr. Bennett, don't you remember me?" asked Mr. Laurie, breaking the silence. The shoemaker turned again and stared at the visitor, the half-finished shoe falling to the floor. "Don't you remember this man either?" asked Mr. Laurie, pointing to Defarge. "I was your banker, and he was your trusted servant. Don't you remember that?" The old man stared blankly in turn at Mr. Laurie and Monsieur Defarge. A glimmer appeared in his eyes, and they clouded over again. With a deep sigh, he went back to his shoemaking. Meanwhile, Lucy had crept along the wall until she could fully see the shoemaker. Her first fears had given way to sorrow and pity and love. She moved softly to her father's side. Dr. Bennett, not seeing her, put down the tool in his hand and picked up his shoemaker's knife. As he did so, he caught sight of Lucy's skirt. He raised his head slowly until he was looking into her face. Mr. Laurie and Monsieur Defarge took a step forward as if to protect Lucy from the knife in the old man's hands. But she motioned them away. "What is this?" the shoemaker gasped in a voice that could be scarcely heard. Without answering, Lucy put her hands to her lips and kissed them to him. Tears streamed down her face. "You are not the jailer's daughter?" asked the old shoemaker. "No," whispered Lucy. "Then who are you?" he gasped weakly. Lucy could not trust herself to speak yet, but she sat down next to him on the bench and laid her hand on his arm. A shiver went through the old man's thin frame, and he drew back. But then he put the knife down and slowly lifted a few strands of the girl's long, golden hair and held it gently between his bony fingers. Then, dropping the hair, just as gently, Lucy's slim shoulder, he untied a piece of folded rag from around his neck and opened it carefully. Inside were several strands of long golden hair. Picking up Lucy's hair again and looking at it closely, the old man gasped. "It is the same." How can it be? When was it? Then he gently turned the girl's face fully toward the light, and the words came out. I remember it very well. That night long ago, when I was called out of the house, she had laid her head on my shoulder. She was afraid for me to go. Then, when I was brought to my prison cell in the North Tower, they found these strands of hair on my sleeve where my daughter had laid her head. The jailer let me keep them, for surely they could not help me escape. But whose hair was it? Was it yours? No, it cannot be. Tell me, what is your name, gentle angel? Grateful for his softened tone, Lucy fell to her knees before him and reached her arms out toward him, cradling his cold white head among her warm, shining curls. Oh, dear sir, she whispered through her tears, you will learn my name at another time. All I can tell you now is that your misery is ended. I will take you to England and make you well and make a home for us. The sight of the pitiful man sunk in his daughter's arms so touched Laurie and Defarge that they looked away, fearful that unmanly tears would reach their own eyes as well. Soon after, the two men left to make all the travel arrangements. Lucy stayed with her father, cradling his limp form in her arms. When all the preparations had been made, Mr. Laurie and Monsieur Defarge returned with hot food and warm traveling cloaks. His face blank with confusion and wonder, Dr. Bennett ate and drank as he was told, and allowed Lucy to wrap him in the cloak. He had been confined in prison and in the attic room for so long that he was barely able to walk. A Tale of Two Cities. As Mr. Laurie helped him down the stairs, Dr. Bennett steadfastly clung to Lucy's hand. Monsieur Defarge picked up the shoemaker's bench and tools and followed them down into the street. Reaching the courtyard, Dr. Bennett looked around, searching for the towers of the prison and the guards at their posts, but only one lone figure was in view, Madame Defarge, who leaned against the door of the wine shop, knitting by the light of the lamp's post. The horses and carriage were waiting. Dr. Bennett, Lucy, and Mr. Laurie climbed inside. As the carriage pulled away, Defarge stood looking at it. I hope he won't regret being recalled to life, he whispered in the night. Chapter 4. The Trial of Charles Darnay. 5 years had passed. It was 1780. Dr. Bennett and his daughter lived in a comfortable house in London. The doctor had regained his health and returned to practicing medicine. Mr. Laurie still worked for Tellson's Bank and continued to travel between its London and Paris offices. England had been at war with her American colonies for 5 years, but was losing battle after battle. France had come to the aid of the colonists, an act which angered England. It was because of these bitter feelings that a trial for treason was in progress at the Old Bailey Courthouse in London. The accused, Charles Darnay, was charged with passing government secrets to the French king about the troops England was sending to North America during the Revolution. The man standing quietly but confidently in the prisoner's box was a tall, handsome, dark-haired gentleman of about 25. From time to time, Charles Darnay's eyes were drawn to two witnesses sitting in the courtroom. They were Dr. Alexander Monet and his daughter, Lucy, whom Charles had met during their trip to London 5 years before, when Lucy was taking her poor, ill father out of France. Because of this meeting, they were being called to testify against the prisoner, as was Mr. Jarvis Laurie, who had accompanied them on that trip. The solicitor or attorney for the British government told the jury that he had planned to prove that Darnay's treason had started 5 years ago, on the eve of the Revolution. The prisoner's lawyers, Mr. Stryver and Mr. Carton, sat at a long table, Stryver listening intently to the government's solicitor, and Carton stared fixedly at the ceiling. The first witness to be called by the solicitor was Mr. John Barsad, a gentleman and former friend of Charles Darnay. "Why are you testifying against the prisoner?" began the solicitor. "Because I discovered his traitorous schemes, sir, and being a patriot, I reported them to the government immediately. And what were these traitorous schemes? He was supplying the French with lists, in his very own handwriting, of British troops' movements to the colonies. When it was Mr. Stryver's turn to cross-examine Barsad, he showed that far from being a gentleman, Barsad was an ex-convict and a gambler, and far from being Darnay's friend, had only met him once in a coach. The solicitor then called Roger Cly, Darnay's servant, as the next witness. "How long have you worked for the prisoner?" began the solicitor. "About 4 years," replied Cly. "Have you ever seen the prisoner with papers listing the troops and military equipment that England was sending to North America?" "Yes, I did." "Where?" "In Mr. Darnay's pockets and in his desk." "And did you ever see him give those papers to anyone else?" "Yes, to some French gentleman on the boat that travels between Dover and Calais." "What do you expect to gain by giving this evidence against the prisoner?" "Nothing whatsoever. I'm doing it for the love of my country. I am a true Englishman." Under cross-examination by Stryver, Cly admitted to having been a thief and working at one time for the French government. The solicitor next called Mr. Jarvis Laurie to the witness stand. "Think back 5 years, Mr. Laurie, to a certain Friday night in November." 1775, he began. "Were you then traveling on business from London to Dover by mail coach?" "I was," replied the banker. "Was there any other passengers in the coach?" "Yes, 2 men." Did those men leave the coach in the middle of the night and continue on the road by foot?" "They did." "Was the prisoner Charles Darnay one of them?" "I really don't know, sir," replied Mr. Laurie, looking at Darnay. "They were covered up, and the night was so dark that I couldn't really see them well through enough to identify them." "Have you ever seen the prisoner before, Mr. Laurie?" "Yes, when I was returning from France a few days after that." "Mr. Darnay was on the same boat that brought me back to England." "At what time did he come aboard at Calais?" "A little after midnight." "Were you traveling alone, Mr. Laurie?" "Alexander Bennett and his daughter Lucy." "And did you speak to the prisoner during that trip?" "No, it was a stormy night, and I spent the entire trip in my cabin." "Thank you, Mr. Laurie," said the solicitor. "That will be all. You may step down. I now call upon Miss Lucy Bennett to testify." The young lady approached the witness stand slowly, looking with great pity at Charles Darnay. "Miss Bennett, when did you first meet the prisoner?" asked the solicitor. "On the boat Mr. Laurie just referred to. I had made a bed for my father on the deck because he was very tired and weak, and I wanted to give him some fresh air. Mr. Darnay protected my father from the wind and cold. He was very kind and gentle toward my father, and I was most grateful to him." "Did the prisoner come on the boat alone?" "No, sir," he said, with 2 French gentlemen who got off the boat before it left Calais. "What were they doing while on board?" "They were looking at some papers and whispering." "What kind of papers were they looking at?" I don't know." "Did the prisoner mention to you anything about his business?" Lucy looked at Charles Darnay and started to sob. Then, turning back to the solicitor, said, "Mr. Darnay was so kind to my father that I hope I won't do him any harm today." "This is your duty, Miss Bennett," snapped the judge. "Just tell the jury what he said." "He told me that he was traveling on important business that could get some people into trouble. Because of that, he was traveling under the false name of Charles Darnay. He also said that this business would be taking him back and forth between English and France for a long time to come." "Did he say whether or not that business concerned the American colonies?" "He said England was foolish to quarrel with America. He even said jokingly that George Washington might become as famous in history as King George III. This answer brought a buzz in the courtroom and a glare from the judge as he made his notes. "An insult to our king," he thought. "Thank you, Miss Bennett," said the solicitor when all was quiet again. "That will be all." I now call Dr. Alexander Bennett to testify. Clearing his throat, the solicitor began. Do you remember the prisoner as the same man you met on the boat 5 years ago? I cannot recall, so I do not remember anything about that period, said the doctor. Dr. Bennett, did you spend a long time in prison in France without a trial? A long time, sir, and because of it my mind is a blank. Or it was until I found myself one day in my London home with my dear daughter caring for me. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I have no further questions, said the solicitor. The doctor left the witness box and went to rejoin his daughter. As they sat down, a new witness was coming. Under questioning, the man testified that on the night of Friday, on Friday night in 1775, he had seen the prisoner waiting for someone in a hotel in a town near where the two passengers had left the mail coach. The solicitor tried to convince the jury that Darnay had left the coach in the dead of night and walked to the hotel to exchange secret military information. Then Charles Darnay's attorney, Mr. Stryver, began to cross-examine the witness. Just then, Mr. Stryver's associate, Mr. Carton, who had not taken any part in the proceedings up to that point, lowered his head from its fixed stare at the ceiling, removed his attorney's wig, and wrote something on a piece of paper. Although Carleton himself had a brilliant mind, his laziness and constant drinking prevented him from becoming a success on his own. Therefore, he had to be content with working for Mr. Stryver, whose successful law practice made Carleton feel extremely jealous. Carton folded the note and passed it to Stryver, who, upon reading it, immediately turned back to the witness he was questioning. Are you absolutely certain that the man in the hotel was the prisoner Charles Darnay? I am quite sure. Did you ever see anyone who looks very much like the prisoner? Not so much alike that I could mistake the two. Look then at that man over there, ordered Stryver, pointing to Sidney Carton. Then look back at the prisoner. The two men looked so much alike that they surprised not only each other, but the judge, the witness, and the entire courtroom as well. Mr. Stryver then summed up his case for the defense. He maintained that John Barsell was a liar, Roger Cly a hired spy and traitor, and that the final witness could not really identify the prisoner as the man he had seen killed, that he had seen at the hotel. The jury then left the room to decide the prisoner's fate. Afternoon stretched into the evening. Lamps were lit in the courtroom. The spectators brought in mutton pies and ale for refreshment. Finally, the jury returned with the verdict, not guilty. The crowds in the courtroom spilled out the doors, and Charles Darnay found himself standing face to face with Sidney Carton. Here are the two look-alikes that fate has thrown down. Said Carton with a drunken laugh. Then it is fate that also makes me feel faint, asked Darnay. Hardly, replied Carton. It is hunger. Come, let us dine together. Once the two men were seated in a nearby tavern, with food and wine restoring Darnay's strength, he thanked Carton warmly. You don't have to thank me much, said the attorney, after a long gulp of wine. It was nothing, but it must feel good to have such a beautiful young lady as Lucy Bennett pity you and cry for you. Carton drank as Charles ate, and continued drinking long after dinner was finished. Finally, Charles rose to go. If you want to know why I am getting drunk, Carleton called after him, it is because I am disappointed with life. I am a failure at everything, my work, my friends. You are everything I am not. No blue eyes would fill with tears for me, as Lucy Bennett did for you. But no matter. I care for no man, and no man cares for me. I'm sorry to hear that, Darnay replied to the figure now slumped over the emptied wine bottles. You might have made better use of your brilliant talents. Later that evening, wakening from a drunken sleep at the tavern, Sidney Carton went to Mr. Stryver's office for help, and some help came. And we'll leave it right there for now, and I'll continue on the next take. Thank you. Bye.